Well, comrades, in order to do justice to the subject of the life of Leon Trotsky, I would require not 1 hour, but many hours. Here was the life of an extraordinary individual which comprised within itself, I think, more achievements than most people could expect to perform even in several lifetimes. Certainly he was one of the two greatest Marxists of the 20th century, alongside Lenin, one of the main leaders and architects of the Russian Revolution of 1917, the founder of the Red Army during the Civil War, the first chairman, when he was only, I think, about 26 years of age, the first chairman of the Petersburg Soviet, a remarkable writer, by the way, not just in a political sense, but even in a literary sense. His autobiography, which I strongly recommend you to read, My Life, is a remarkable work of literature, a remarkable human document, never mind about its extraordinary political interest. And the history of the Russian Revolution, his masterpiece in 3 volumes, really is obligatory reading for anyone that wishes to understand the Russian Revolution of 1917. Extraordinary achievements. And this man began his political activity when he was 18 years of age. I think some of you might be 18 or a little bit more than 18. When he was 18 years, under the most terrible, difficult conditions that you can imagine. He was born in a middle-class family, a Jewish small landowner was his father, in the Ukraine, in a period of the darkest and the most terrible repression of Tsarist Russia that you could imagine. I mean, now it's become fashionable. I haven't read Conquest's book, I suppose. Is it Conquest or Service? I can't remember his name. Service. He does great service to the world capitalism and imperialism, so the name fits the man. I suppose I'll have to read his wretched book. But you see, it's become fashionable now to pour dirt on the history of the Russian Revolution and to slander the leaders, Lenin, Trotsky, and so on and so forth. They were evil men and bloodthirsty monsters and so on. That shouldn't surprise any sensible person, because the ruling class throughout history has always had and felt a profound necessity to slander and to calumny all revolutions and revolutionaries. You know, it might come as a surprise to some of you. There was a time, not long ago, when Oliver Cromwell was regarded as a bloodthirsty monster because he was the leader of a bourgeois revolution in this country. When Thomas Carlyle, the great historian of the 19th century, came to write a work about Oliver Cromwell, he said, before I could write a word about Oliver Cromwell, I first of all had to drag out his body from under a heap of dead dogs, all the slanders that heaped on the head of this man. The French Revolution is the same. You probably wouldn't remember, it was about 20 odd years ago when it was the anniversary of the French Revolution. It was astonishing the amount of hatred which they still pour on the heads of people like Robespierre and Marat and other great revolutionaries, without whom modern France wouldn't exist. They can't forgive revolutionaries. And of course the idea is this: it's not sufficient, it never is sufficient for the ruling class to defeat a revolution. It is necessary to destroy and eradicate its memory, to obliterate its memory, such that the younger generation, namely yourselves, will never be tempted to follow that road. And that's the reason why they engage in this orgy of hatred and slander. What they conveniently forget is this: what sort of country was Russia before the revolution of 1917? They never talk about that. It was a monstrous, brutal, bloody dictatorship under the Tsar, the Romanovs, the dynasty that lasted 1,000 years. based on anti-Semitism, racism, systematic slaughter of innocent Jews and ordinary people. The workers had no rights, no legal trade unions, no legal parties, no parliament, no democracy, no nothing. An illiterate population kept in ignorance, dominated by the church, the state, and so on. The gendarmes, the police. Now I'll tell you something that might surprise you. If I were to establish a parallel between the situation, the political role of Russian Tsarism and a modern state, that state would have to be the United States of America. I mean, what would you say if I said, well, you can have a socialist revolution in America? You'd probably say, well, Alan Woods is quite a nice chap, but he's not quite all there, not quite the full shilling, as they used to say, you know. And yet, here you had a situation in Tsarist Russia, a monstrous police state which crushed revolutions in Europe throughout history, particularly 1848. Those were described us. It was the bulwark, the bastion of world reaction. And it was a monstrous state, as I say. You stood no chance. You could not organize a political fight. You couldn't have a meeting in this garden. You'd be instantly arrested and sent to Siberia for quite a long time. It was under these monstrous conditions that one courageous young man, 18 years of age, entered politics. It was a dangerous thing to do at that time, and joined the young Marxist movement, which in those days was known as the Social Democratic Movement. It's an historical question. They were Marxists, revolutionary, tiny groups in conditions of complete illegality. But at that time, there was the beginnings of the development of the Russian working class, particularly in the 1880s and particularly the 1890s, with the development of the railways and industry in certain parts of Russia, in the western part in particular. Factories were set up, and poor, hungry, illiterate peasants were dragged off the land, as happens in many countries, in India and so on, at the present time, and hurled into what Trotsky described as the seething cauldron of factory life, working for slave wages under slave conditions, with no rights, no trade, no right to strike, and so on. And incredibly, this young man, along with thousands of other young men, began to agitate and try to establish contacts with the workers. Not a bad thing to do, by the way, for the university socialist society. You mustn't just conduct your work in the university, you must try to get contacts with the working class. And Trotsky describes it in his autobiography, how as a young man of 18 he'd spend all night writing pamphlets. Handwritten pamphlets. There was no internet, you couldn't print out or download or anything like that. Handwritten, he didn't even have a typewriter. He used to say he took a lot of pride over writing as well as he could so that it would be legible to the workers. And these leaflets had an effect. As Trotsky's first nickname, Trotsky itself is a nickname, it's not his name was Bronstein, Lev Bronstein, Jewish name. Trotsky was actually the name of one of his jailers when he was in prison. He took that as a pseudonym, as good as any other, I suppose. Trotsky was his jailer. The man would have been horrified to find out the history of what happened to his name in history. So, but anyway, his first nickname was Perot, which in the Russian language means the pen, because he was a very good writer. Yes, but his very good writing got him into trouble with the authorities. He was arrested, and at 18 years of age, he was first of all sent to prison for revolutionary activity. Of course, the prisons in those days were full of revolutionaries. They served as schools for revolutionaries. He was subsequently sent to Siberia. He escaped from Siberia. He escaped twice from Siberia, to be exact. And in 1902, this young man turned up where? Here, in London. Incredibly, now they want to keep all the foreigners out. But there was a time when the British capitalist class was so confident of themselves, they even allowed Karl Marx to come here as a refugee and write Capital in the British Museum. I think they're probably a bit sorry for that nowadays, but they did. And they allowed Lenin to come here, and they allowed Trotsky to come here, and so on. Trotsky turned up on Lenin's doorstep in the early hours of the morning, banging on the door. Lenin wasn't very pleased if he woken up, but he was delighted to have a young man that helped him to build. To build what? To build the first Russian workers' movement, which had to be built abroad. Such were the conditions in Russia. They could not do any work inside. They tried a Congress, I think it was in 1897, if I'm not mistaken. They were immediately, all of them were arrested, sent to Siberia. So it had to be done abroad. Here in London, they produced a paper called Iskra, which means the spark, which they smuggled, God knows how, they smuggled it by different means into Russia. And it took off. It connected with the mood of the mass of the workers that was beginning to take off. There were mass strikes and so on at that time. And eventually these mass strikes led to a revolution. It's very similar, by the way, to the situation you have now in Iran. Striking similarities, but that's a separate subject for discussion. Under these terribly difficult conditions, they succeeded in putting together what was really the first Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, as it was then known. They must have had a few thousand members in Russia. They were in contact with the factories. In my house in East Ham, I've actually got a complete set of Lenin's Iskra, written at that time. Very interesting. Not very attractive, no pictures, no crosswords, no sport, no television, nothing like that. Just blocks of print. Yes, but it included brilliant theoretical, political articles, mainly written by Lenin, also by Trotsky, Plekhanov and others. It also included pages of reports from the factories inside Russia. It was a workers' paper, even at that time. They had the first Congress on the basis of enormous success of building the organization. And what happened? There was a split. At the very first Congress, just imagine that, all this difficulty building up, all the problems that you face, the dangers, there was a split. And what was worse, nobody knew what the split was about. Nobody had the faintest idea. Lenin didn't know this well. You read the political sessions, there was no differences on politics. None whatsoever. It was apparently secondary organizational questions. But those organizational differences subsequently developed into important political differences, and you had the crystallization of two tendencies within the Russian movement, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. The Bolshevik tendency was led by Lenin. Trotsky was a bit confused at that time. He didn't really grasp what was going on. It's not true that he was a Menshevik, as is often stated. He tried to adopt an independent position, a kind of unitary position, which is a position one sometimes comes across. So for some years he stood outside the Bolsheviks and outside the Mensheviks. Now a split, of course, causes a lot of problems, a lot of damage. There's always three tendencies in every split: the majority, the minority, and the ones that go home. And very often the ones that go home are in the majority. So why am I saying this? Well, by the time the first Russian Revolution broke out, it's an astonishing thing. Nobody expected this. Nobody expected this. Everyone thought that everything was quiet, everything's under control, workers not able to move. There were no legal unions. The only legal unions allowed were organized by the police, if you can believe that. The Zubatov unions. The one in Petersburg was run by a priest, Father Gapon, who was a police agent. And yet, this very right-wing reactionary union, under the pressure of the workers, in January 1905 organized a demonstration which led to a massacre on the 9th of January. And within hours, the whole situation was transformed. By the way, don't be fooled by this idea, well, people are not revolutionary, people are not listening, and so on and so forth. That may appear to be the case. But you see, actually, and the workers are backward, the workers are not revolutionary. How many times have I heard that same old song? Well, how backward can you get? The average Russian worker at that time was a peasant who had recently come off the land, a man that couldn't read or write, whose favourite pastime was drinking vodka and beating his wife, who went to church, who believed in God fervently, and was completely under the influence of this Father Gapon. So much so that when the Bolsheviks, by the way, they were a very small group, only a couple of hundred perhaps, can't remember the actual figures, and the Mensheviks were no better off. When they tried to distribute leaflets calling for a republic and an 8-hour day, the workers that were on strike tore up the leaflets, and quite often they beat them up as well, for good measure. Because they believed in the Tsar. They believed in the monarchy. They were monarchists. I repeat, how backward can you get? Apparently. And yet after the massacre of the 9th of January, when the Tsar's